Good afternoon. This is Celia Lacayo again with LA Social Science, Associate Director of Community Engagement. I also teach in the African American Studies and Chicana Central American Studies Department. Today we have amazing two guests that will be talking about the importance of the November election, specifically here in California, looking at Proposition 16. This is has a very long, lengthy California history. As we know, Prop 209 eliminated affirmative action in California and has had a huge impact. A very negative one towards minorities and women specifically. So today we have two experts. First, we have Maria Ledesma. She is an associate professor in educational leadership at San Jose State University. And we also have with us today Oyan Poon, who is an associate professor affiliate in educational policy at University of Illinois at Chicago. And these are experts and folks who have been really doing the great work with Proposition 16. Hello, how are you both today?
Well,
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you for asking. And how are you?
I'm very excited. As we know, the UC Regents have had a very strong role in affirmative action in Prop 209, which I know you all will address today. And so we're going to start with that. So can you all please explain why affirmative action was needed in the first place?
Well, I think that it boils down to a kind of simplistic notion, basically, that because racism is a problem, because racism and sexism are problems, and that in the state of California and society more broadly should care about those problems, that we need policy tools to address these problems appropriately. And so we need these race-conscious lenses to address the racial and ethnic disparities and gender disparities that we continue to experience in society, and including in California, where increasingly the demographics are diversifying, but that's not being seen in various measures of social well-being. And so we need to get to the root of the systemic problems of these disparities in racism and sexism, and affirmative action has historically provided a key foundational platform for doing so.
yes, I agree. And I would only add that in simplest form, affirmative action is a way to integrate higher education. And as Dr. Poon laid out, there are very real inequalities that continue to exist. California is a highly segregated state, especially with respect to high schools. And what results are schools that do not have an equal access to rigorous college preparatory curriculum and qualified credentialed teachers. So what affirmative action does is it becomes one tool, one factor that allows the consideration of race in admissions. And I would also say that it's important to remember that even though the spotlight often is on undergraduate admissions, the reason that affirmative action is needed is that it impacts everything. And that is that in order for individuals to become doctors and professionals, you first have to start at the undergraduate level. So when we are tinkering and limiting access in undergrad, we are also having a ripple effect throughout the entire pipeline.
And I would also add, I think it's important to remember, you mentioned, Dr. Lacayo, that Prop 16 would overturn Proposition 209. And while college admissions is absolutely central to that, there's two other areas affected in Proposition 209. One is public employment, and second is public contracting. And so what that means is that, for example, with the public employment, I think about school teachers in California. They certainly do not look like our school children today, who are majority are students of color. And we have education research that shows that in K-12, students do better when they at least have some role models in their teachers and educational leaders to look up to. And in contracting, because of 209, there's been a massive drop in public contracts that get awarded to minority and women-owned businesses. I helped with a study several years ago on comparing Asian American businesses in San Francisco, Chicago, and Atlanta. And the Asian American businesses in San Francisco suffered the most. They were lagging behind the most in comparison to these two other places that are nowhere near as highly concentrated in population as Asian Americans or Asian American businesses for that matter. And so the proposition in 1996 with 209 has just added to the disparities and held people back from access to opportunities.
So as you can hear, these are great experts. And let me remind you, these are UC alumni. These are folks that came up through the UC system and know this a great deal from both personal and analytical point. So moving forward, why did voters decide to pass 209 that eliminated affirmative action in California?
So this is somewhat a complicated issue, but then at the same time, not really. Supporters of Proposition 209 intentionally misnamed or the ballot initiative to the California Civil Rights Initiative. And this was a tactic that was intentionally used to lure voters who otherwise would have supported the continuance of race-conscious policies. They thought they would be voting for civil rights, when instead what they were doing was voting for the elimination of race-conscious social policies in higher education, contracting, and hiring. And so this was a very strategic move. Reams and volumes of research has been written about how this strategy proved to be very successful. The proposition passed at a rate of 54%, but crucially, it also served as a blueprint for many other states to take on similar initiatives and to lead a wave of propositions that would do away with race-conscious policy. It was a blueprint that created mass confusion and that has been successful to date in all but one of the states in which it was proposed. But I think at its core, the reason that the proposition passed is because it was intentionally named to echo the life and language of historic civil rights icons such as MLK. And yet what it did was actually damage the legacies of civil rights by taking away one of the very tools that was necessary to integrate higher education.
And I love that you brought up, Dr. Ledesma, the besmirching, quite frankly, of Dr. Martin Luther King's legacy and words. And in the opposition to Proposition 16, I've noticed them appropriating again MLK's image and very short line of words. And my favorite moment, I think, in the last couple months has been when one of his daughters, Dr. Bernice King, tweeted out, "Stop it. Stop misusing my father's words." And I love that she actually said, you need to study harder, essentially. Try to study my dad's words a little harder and go beyond just this one sentence. As you can imagine, the opposition didn't like it, but I so appreciated that, the family, MLK's family, is coming out and saying, quit it, and endorsing Prop 16. I think that's really important to know that. And the other thing that's really important and interesting is that in 1996, only white voters voted in the majority to support Prop 209, in other words, to end affirmative action, whereas all voters of color segments in the majority voted to maintain affirmative action. And so they voted against Proposition 209. I think that's one of the myths as well, is that that Asian Americans oppose affirmative action, but in 1996, 61% of Asian American voters voted against Prop 209. So people of color knew this was some trickery, as Dr. Ledesma was talking about, and we weren't buying it.
Yeah, and I think it's also, you remind me that it's important also to set this within a historic context. That Proposition 209 was one of a slew of propositions that were anti immigrant, very nativist, and Proposition 209 was sandwiched between Proposition 187, which aimed to do away with the benefits of immigrants to education, and then Proposition 227, which sought to actually eliminate bilingual education altogether. So there was a slew of propositions that were, again, very nativist and attacking historically underrepresented minoritized groups. And so much so that when a fourth proposition, Proposition 54, came on the ballot, that one was defeated. But this showed a pattern. It showed a pattern of the leadership at the time, and it's a pattern that has resulted in different types of political change that I'm sure you can have another podcast about.
So again, this is really critical. These are mentions of these myths that often the opposition very much run with, just inaccurate, things that are not factual. So this is important to clarify. Moving along those lines, what are some other myths affirmative action and folks who are opposing Prop 16 are in play to really bring clarity to our voters and for them to really understand the great impact passing Proposition 16 would be?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of myths that really come from a lack of awareness of what the federal legal case laws are. So, for example, I often hear, well, I don't want racial quotas in play to limit people because, and especially I hear this amongst East Asian Americans when they say, well, California is 13% Asian American. The UC undergraduate population is much more than that. Will that mean if Prop 16 is passed, will that mean that the UC will then diminish the numbers from about 40% of the undergraduates to that 14%? And that would be, number one, first and foremost, illegal and unconstitutional. And as an Asian American myself and a mom who hopes my child decides, maybe to consider the UC, I hope that, that's something that I am personally invested in as well. And so I feel very confident in knowing that, well, number one, the Supreme Court ruled quotas unconstitutional in 1978 in the Bakke case. I was 2 years old at that time. And so when I still hear this myth that affirmative action is a quota, I don't even have memory of that time, quite frankly. And so it's just really astounding to see that this myth persists. Another myth I hear a lot is that it wouldn't be fair, that if you checked off an underrepresented minority box, that you would get extra points or a preference. There is no such thing as that either. Partly due because of the Gratz v. Bollinger Supreme Court case in 2003, which ruled that rigid systems like that, automatic mechanical systems like that, were not constitutional. And instead, what ended up happening because of the Bakke case, because of the Gratz case, as well as the twin law school case at Michigan, Bollinger, Grutter versus Bollinger, and also more recently in 2016 in Fisher versus UT Austin, the Supreme Court has over and over again said, yes, diversity is very important and it's a compelling public interest to allow for race to, as Dr. Ledesma mentioned, race can be a factor, one of many, many factors. It cannot be the factor that anyone would be admitted or awarded an opportunity. And it has to be individualized review. So every individual applicant is reviewed for their merits individually within their context of opportunity. And so that's really important to recognize that these are individualized reviews. They're not oh, I checked a box, and so that means I'm automatically, admitted or not. And I think that's a really dangerous myth out there too that foments, I think, racial divisiveness and tension, because people do want to be recognized and reviewed and respected as individuals, and that's exactly what race-conscious admissions processes do legally. And I think that's really important to remember. And I think this is partly a third myth, which is that there's such a thing as race-based admissions. Nobody is basing one's admission on one's race, right? And so I'm currently in the midst of finishing an extensive study where I've interviewed 51 admissions officers across the country at highly selective colleges and universities. And I can definitely say that first and foremost, it's all about academic quality. And yes, high school GPA transcripts and test scores matter, but that's not the only two pieces of information that help admissions officers understand one's academic quality. There's a lot of other data points to consider. And then outside of academics, colleges and universities have lots of other aims and goals, like, having the best possible educational environments, and diversity is a key ingredient in that. And so considering race as one among many factors is an important practice.
If I could add just a few more myths, unfortunately, there are many that continue. And I think, Oyan laid out some really important ones, but there's others that continue to linger, again, despite the fact that these are myths, untrue. And I think one of them, both of you alluded to, and that is that students are granted admission who are unqualified. And this is just patently untrue. You are not granted or handed over a golden ticket of admission into a UC campus if you are not eligible. So I think that that's critically important to understand. Also, there is a myth that race-neutral proxies exist that can adequately take the place of a race-conscious admissions practice. And that, again, is not true. There has been, in the span of the time since the implementation of Proposition 209, the elimination of race-conscious policy, the UC system has spent well over $500 billion with a B dollars on race-neutral alternatives, and nothing has proven successful in replacement of race, of the consideration of race. I think also some very troubling myths that continue is that students who are admitted into campuses that practice race-conscious policies suffer from stigma, that there is a stigma attached to them, that the only reason they were admitted were because of this policy. And that's, again, simply not true. I think it's just a very, unfortunately, problematic way of framing and really trying to be faux altruistic, of trying to supposedly care for the intended victims of race-conscious policy. I will offer a quick anecdote that when you review the volumes of amicus briefs that are filed in support of race-conscious policies, you often hear professionals tackle this issue on. Specifically, there was a brief by Black women lawyers in the Greta Gratz cases who said that, if they were to suffer from stigma, thankfully, because of their professional jobs, they could afford therapy. So, that is, a clever retort to it. But again, it's just a damaging myth. Also, there is the issue by extension of mismatch, that students who are admitted under affirmative action are often admitted into campuses where they are either unprepared or ill-prepared to compete academically. And what we've learned from the research is actually, if you go to an institution such as a UC campus, you're more likely not only to graduate, but to pursue postgraduate study. And so again, a very damaging myth.
It is really critical to tackle these myths because that better helps us understand why Proposition 16 is needed. Similarly, both of our experts are very well versed on understanding specifically the research that comes out of UC, the UC system, that looked at the impact of Prop 209 meaning what happened after affirmative action was eliminated in California, and why that really means a lot and what that meant to our society in California.
On the immediate heels of the passage of Proposition 209 in 1996, and this is before its implementation in 1998, there was an immediate and precipitous drop in the number of applications from historically underrepresented groups into the UC system, and also the yield, the admission rate into the UC system. So that happened immediately. Since then, there has been a marginal increase in the representation of historically underrepresented undergraduate students into the UC system. But the representation gap that existed continues to exist at the graduate and professional levels. That is that the impact of the passage of Proposition 209 resulted not just in a drop in undergraduate admissions. The spotlight often is on undergraduate admissions, but the repercussions have a ripple effect way beyond that. As we alluded to earlier, the tracks, if you will, of admission into graduate and professional schools were heavily impacted, and those actually have been slow to recover, as have the diversification of the faculty ranks in the UC system. So those are some of the effects that have happened. With respect to undergraduate admissions, we've seen a little bit of an increase in the representation of undergraduate students of color, in particular Latino or Latinx students, into the UC system, but that also can be explained by the immense demographic growth in the period of time since the passage of 209. The same has not been true for African American, Indigenous, Native American students. Those remain very stagnant and very underrepresented to this day.
So we're going to begin to conclude and ask our experts the last question to really understand now what you can do to really make a difference. And not only voting, but voting in California and these propositions, which are many, which will have a critical impact on our lives and our children's lives and generations to come. So please let us know, why is Prop 16 so important today, and how will it make California strong and a leader in the country?
Yeah, so I can start there as the non-Californian now. So Maria and I were both grad students at UCLA in education together a while ago. When I think a fun fact about Maria was that she was the student regent for the University of California when we were grad students, and I was the president of the University of California Student Association. So even though among this group here, I am no longer residing in California, I am so invested in this election in California. I'm invested in the election period in this country because can we just look around us right now and take a deep breath? But, you know, I was talking with my students recently about how in the last 2 weeks, we have gone from Justice Ginsburg's passing to the nomination of Amy Coney Barrett to this, I think Monday or Tuesday, coronavirus reached 1 million deaths globally. And a president who cannot say that white supremacy is bad. And the week before that, congressional Republicans refusing to vote on a resolution to say anti-Asian racism is bad. This is the world that we are living in, and my neck is very tense from the whiplash that I'm feeling in just watching the news, and my husband is just like, turn it off. But I can't, and I'm seeing this dumpster fire of anti-Black racism that, you know, we are going through nationally a racial reckoning that I think we need to just acknowledge, right? You know, as an Asian American, certainly my community is concerned about the anti-Asian racism from the COVID pandemic, and politicians who keep wanting to call it China virus or the Kung flu and so on and so forth. You know, in this moment, and you know, Celia, you mentioned the Me Too movement. It started a couple years ago. We know that racism and sexism remain rampant and, quite frankly, feel like they're on the rise, and becoming really apparent. And so anyone who says that this isn't a problem, it feels like someone saying, well, how we solve the COVID pandemic is to just not test for the virus, right? That is no way to solve any problem. We need to be conscious of these problems. We need to allow public leaders and social institutional leaders the policy tools necessary to first say racism and sexism are bad and they are problems, and we need to engage in the analysis and data to construct solutions. We know that there are some solutions out there and practices that can stem the tide and hopefully offer a much more hopeful future. If I'm sounding just tired, so I just think please Californians, for the sake of the rest of us, vote for Prop 16. I think California has an amazing opportunity to really lead the way in pushing for anti-racist policies and an anti-racist future.
Yes. To that, I would add that one of the things that was an unfortunate consequence of the passage of Proposition 209 is that the state as a whole suffered a tremendous talent loss when we lost lots of students who sought to educate themselves out of state because they either did not gain admissions into a UC campus, did not apply to begin with, and then gain admissions, or decided they opted to go to an institution where they felt they were going to be better served, and they felt that there was going to be more of a critical mass of them, and also financial aid available. Let us not forget that one of the things that is impacted is not just admissions, it's all of the kind of stratified mechanisms that come with that, including financial aid and resources that are impacted when you cannot use race-conscious policy. So I think the importance of re-implementing this tool is that, first and foremost, it is not a mandate. What it does is simply lifts some of the limitations and allows institutions that wish to implement a race-conscious policy to do so. So I think that's critical. I think it's also important to remember that California, as Dr. Poon was suggesting, is a nation state. It has a tremendous economy, and it is really unwise to stratify its future workforce by undereducating a majority of its population. So there is an interest convergence in terms of educating the population to increase the overall tax base for future Californians. So that in itself should be an interest that folks should look to. But it's not the only reason. There's a moral reason. This is a majority minority state. And it's important that all students have the ability to aspire to gain admission into the UC system if they so desire.
Absolutely. And so here we can hear two experts on affirmative action who have dedicated a lot of their professional life and time to really understanding the legacy of 209, what that impact was, and the legacy that you and us as voters can really make the change now. I think that to echo both Oyan and Maria, really, a lot of folks are about, these principles, but we have to really enact them. And for us to do so right now, the best way is to vote and really get out on these propositions, particularly Prop 16. If we are truly to hold the values, these American values that we talk about in terms of equality, equity, and democracy. So again, I'm Celia Lacayo with LA Social Science, and we'll catch you next time.